Afternoon, everybody. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes for the final couple of people to join us, and then we'll get going. So 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll get going. Afternoon again, everyone. To those who've just joined us, we've had an influx of people join in the last 30 seconds, so I think we'll get going. So welcome to our first webinar of April, where we'll be covering the vulnerabilities and exploitations. We're joined by Senior Penetration Tester and Research Lead Rob Jepson, and he'll be looking into the speed at which vulnerabilities are found and exploited by attackers, as well as explaining the impact of this. We're going to run for about 45 minutes today, leaving 15 minutes at the end for any questions. As Rob goes through, send any questions you have on the chat box, and we'll make sure that these are answered in the 15-minute Q&A session at the end. And also, if anyone wants any further information after the webinar, just pop us an email and we'll get back to you straight away. I think we're about ready to get going, so I'll hand you over to Rob now, and I'll speak to you shortly. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the intro. Can you hear me okay, yeah? I'm going to assume so. Right, so hi everybody, welcome to the webinar, Exploitation at Speed, Beating Bad Actors to Find Vulnerabilities in Your Systems. I am Rob. I used to be a developer. That was quite a few years ago, but then I started getting into offensive security because I realized I preferred breaking things to fixing things. I got into pen testing for a while. That was quite fun. I really enjoyed breaking things, but then I gradually realized that actually the real fun was in the code. I didn't really like looking at things from just a black box perspective. I liked having the code and being able to figure that out as well, and then fixing it as well. It gradually led to me going into cybersecurity research, as well as pen testing, and I do quite a lot of DevSecOps with the dev team here at Clarinet. So there's quite a lot of different hats that I wear, but I found that the offensive security stuff mixed with the internal SecOps has given me a lot of insight into the threat landscape. So like as a pen tester, I would like hack, report, and forget. I wouldn't really need to worry about what was happening on a broader sort of perspective. But now I don't have the luxury of forgetting. I kind of need to actually stay on top of things. We need to be aware of what's going on. And this has led perfectly into the research aspect of things. Seeing the threat landscape is really, really interesting when you start digging into it. And that's what we'll be going over today. So this talk is about the increasing speed and criticality of bugs being exploited at scale by threat actors. With the speed of exploitation we're seeing today, and that's coupled with like modern cloud architecture, rapid deployment of servers, plus the massive increase of working from home, it's becoming quite evident that the external attack perimeter of a modern org needs to be seen as more of a risk than ever before. So that's the gist, but the actual agenda, specifically, we're going to be discussing the impact because this can be pretty bad. We're going to go into the particular focus of how these issues could have been avoided as well. So it's not just going to be a matter of this is how bad things are. We're also going to be going over some case studies, reviewing some results from Honeypots that we've deployed because we were trying to research the threat landscape, and the best way to do that is to see what's being attacked in the wild. With that, we want to see what's being attacked, how quickly it's being attacked. We also want to discuss, finally, the scope of the problem, and we want to share some techniques and processes that we employ internally with our clients to reduce those risks. So the first question is, what does exploited in the wild actually mean? Threat actors take advantage of the weakest point of an organization's operational security. So phishing is pretty much always successful for targeted attacks. I don't think there's a single like red team or phishing engagement where, with like an organization of more than one person where phishing has not worked. But that isn't what we're going to be covering today. We're going to be looking at mass exploitation. Phishing kind of gets a lot of street cred, I guess, like it's something that everybody seems to know about. But I think that mass exploitation is a different kind of aspect of things. It's pretty much always successful. If you're an attacker and you want to go for a broad attack and get like hack a server indiscriminately, you're going to be successful if you target the entire internet or even a subset of the internet. So we're using the definition of exploited in the wild to represent bugs and vulnerabilities that are being exploited by threat actors across the whole internet, but it can also mean a targeted attack. We're not covering phishing, as I mentioned, so we're just going to be focusing on this kind of external attack perimeter. So attacks that are exploited in the wild will significantly compromise the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the asset, the CAA triangle, and it will give an attacker a foothold into then potentially attack the wider organization or completely undermine the wider organization's like reputation, for example. For immediate critical threats, like for example, Log4Shell, which we'll get to, there are a significant amount of opportunistic attacks happening. So a new vulnerability will come out, there'll be a proof of concept, and if it's easy to exploit and it's critical, then we find that this will be hit very quickly. And generally botnets are going to be the fastest to hit these vulnerabilities. So these are some botnets that we've seen exploiting these issues through research and stuff. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's an interesting look into them because Kinsing, the most prolific Log4Shell exploitation by quite a long way, Mirai created a wormable version of Log4Shell. So basically that means that if they manage to compromise a machine, that would then go and compromise other machines by just scanning the local area network and things like that. Interestingly as well with Mirai, they years ago now published the source code, made it open source, an open source botnet, so they covered their tracks because that meant that it was very difficult for people, incident response teams, blue teams, to actually identify where it originated, see a lot of the attacks and techniques because it existed in the same thing. So the Mushstick botnet was actually a fork of Mirai. But what can botnets actually do? What are the reasons to avoid being hacked by a botnet? Luckily, they're not sophisticated threat actors, but the things they can do are still really bad. So usually emerging critical vulnerabilities are being exploited at scale by botnets. So there's like a bed of different easy to exploit vulnerabilities and exploits that exist, and they'll have like a collection of them that they use. A lot of the time they will be focused on a specific type of attack. So like it will be on Internet of Things. IoT botnets are quite large because you can have a lot of Internet of Things devices, and botnets are ideal for having a lot of different internet connected devices. The idea of routing malicious traffic is that it uses your system as a proxy to hack other targets, kind of like a VPN. So your IP address is now being used as part of an adversarial campaign. Obviously, you don't want that. Installing further malware, this can be a variety of different things. It's kind of a catch-all, but it means that they can pivot into internal systems if for some reason you are deemed a necessary or relevant target. Deploying ransomware, creating a worm, for example, like Mirai, you'd be able to, basically do anything they want on your zombie machine, which can still be acting in a normal kind of way. So it will seem like everything is fine, but then you might notice that the CPU is always at 100% because, for example, it's usually being used to mine cryptocurrency, because the idea of a botnet is that it's going for kind of quick, easy wins, quite a lot of the time just to make money. And DDoS attacks are actually quite a common way for botnet owners, I guess, to actually to sell their services, because DDoS as a service is something that's happening quite a lot recently, where they will the botnet owner will sell your bandwidth to anyone wanting to try and say use it to then take down another, like a competitor web application or a competitor's server or VPN. Bearing in mind that because of the prevalence now of working from home, if an attacker, if a competitor, like some nefarious competitor wanted to take out your business, a really good way of taking out something like an operational perspective would be to just use DDoS attacks for hire and attack your VPN connection. If it was like a weaker VPN connection, if there was like some kind of issue there, maybe the server becomes overwhelmed. Now nobody can connect to the VPN, and suddenly you're left in a situation where you can't, nobody can work. This is what the kind of attacks that happens, and is worth being aware of, because it can be pretty bad. So the business impact, We've mentioned some of the operational risk, but of course ransomware plays into part there. You can also see financial losses, because if not just necessarily a botnet, but if like a less sophisticated attacker, somebody scanning the whole internet, discovers that you have a Bitcoin wallet just sitting on a server for some reason, or they want to try and steal intellectual property, this is kind of within the remit of what they're able to do now, because they have access to a server, and then they can pivot and potentially take things out of a wider organization. There's also regulatory risk. If you're storing personal data of users, then there are GDPR issues to consider, which can then lead, unfortunately, into reputational risk, because of GDPR, if you have a data breach, you'll need to inform your users, and by doing that, you kind of have to publicly disclose the fact that you have been hacked, which is really not something that you want to be disclosing publicly. That could bring unwanted media attention. And something else that you don't really see a massive amount in this day and age, but it still kind of happens, is like your web applications being defaced. So you would maybe get like a hacking group just sort of like putting some ridiculous banner on there back in the early 2000s. But the more modern kind of thing there is that your web applications are then being reused to serve up malware. So it's like a trusted domain, example.com, and then that could be potentially reused because the server has been hacked, and then that can then serve the botnet. And the issue there lies in the fact that you have effectively now got a domain that is going to be put on all of the ban lists. It's going to be virus total is going to be all over that. So you're going to find that there are some issues there, not just reputationally, because obviously you've got now, it looks like you're providing malware to people, but also that leads to operational issues, because maybe people with antiviruses won't even be able to access your website or your servers and log into the VPN. So as I mentioned before, we're not going to go into like post-exploitation stuff. We're going to focus mostly on the initial entry point. But we do have a previous webinar on adversary simulation. And in this case, we actually went and got remote code execution from basically what I'm talking about here. That in fact, we've seen this exact vulnerability being hit from the Honeypots. But from this, that led to a full compromise of the internal Active Directory. It was like, we got domain admin, which isn't great, but this is because the server that was being targeted was an IIS server, which is running on Windows, and the Windows machine, the Windows server, was domain joined. So this basically led from various pivots to an entire like global compromise, which was quite interesting. But that's the kind of extent as to how bad this can get. So now we're going to, now we're going to go over the results of some research we did on using honeypots. Basically, this is like become kind of a core part of what we're doing, and we use them to stay aware of the threat landscape. This data is just a sort of 2 to 4 week period, and it's configured to look like a real host. So actually, not just hey, I'm a honeypot, although you'll see in a second, port 2233 is quite obvious. But we have like real DNS records that look like juicy hosts, juicy targets. So like banking, finance, that kind of stuff. So SSH and RDP brute forcing occurs pretty much immediately on a service. What we found is that it doesn't really matter if you've got like an admin console, or specifically SSH. As soon as that service goes live, you're going to be seeing traffic getting hit on that service, brute forcing you. That's just sort of a fact of life at this point. I think every IP address in the IP4 space is just being constantly hit on port 22, and the same is very much the case with RDP. Although we haven't found as much in terms of RDP. This is focused generally on Linux servers, but the same very much does apply with Windows from what we've seen. Malicious traffic going to web servers, if you have a domain name, if you have an SSL certificate pointing at that domain name, like any kind of subdomain as well, then there's actually an open data set of SSL certificate transparency logs, I think from Google, which allows, I think, attackers basically, and also bug bounty hunters, it's a really interesting one for security researchers, but like this log, this transparency log, will detail your certificates and then that will mean that it's being hit pretty quickly. So like, and it will be used routing through that vhost. So like you end up finding that, excuse me 1 second. Yeah, you end up finding that this leads to the actual specific, potentially sensitive host being sent malicious traffic. And if it's a web server with like something running on it that maybe shouldn't be, not that shouldn't be, but like an administrative interface or something to that effect with weak credentials, as we'll see, that gets hit pretty quickly and pretty bad. And yeah, the mass exploitation of critical vulnerabilities can actually occur before there's a patch. This isn't just meant to be a the sky is falling type issue. We didn't see exploitation of, say, Log4Shell before there was a patch. But at the same time, there have definitely been some researchers with like massive honeypot networks that have identified that like the details of especially stuff like Log4Shell, that gets passed out pretty quickly. That disseminates, I guess, across sort of like the wider security and black hat community. So gradually you start seeing an uptick in that traffic. We'll get to that soon. Then we have a full Log4Shell postmortem. So this was the initial kind of like result of just having a look at what port scans we were having. I'm not going to go through the full methodology and bore you with it, but the basic gist is that count is sort of like every request, every TCP full handshake to that particular part. In fact, no, it wasn't full handshake. It was an nmap scan, but regardless, as I say, not the methodology, that's not important. What we found is that SSH, of course, by a wide margin, is the most hit service. And the reason for that as well is probably because it's also being brute forced as soon as an attacker identifies that there is SSH running. Like they'll start brute forcing it, and each one of these counts also represents a brute force attempt. Because these can just be, I mean, the way that port scanning works is that it's just basically a normal request. So you would be port scanned on port 22 if somebody just made an SSH request. But what was really interesting to me is that we advertised port 22 as a honeypot SSH to collect credentials and to try and look at what was coming in. But then we put the real SSH on port 2233. I kind of want to put it on a weaker port because I had a sneaking suspicion that it would be found quite quickly. But you can see there that the count is the second from the highest, like an order of magnitude greater than just the web server. That to me is pretty interesting because that was also being brute forced. So we're maybe looking at the next honeypot having a variety of different SSH like ports running different honeypots, and then just not even connecting via SSH. But I would be really interested to see what's going on there, because the fact that we put SSH on a non-standard port and then that was immediately identified and then brute forced by attackers just on the internet is quite eye-opening. And then the rest of these, ignoring HTTP web because that's potentially just web crawlers, or as we'll see, some of the web attacks. There are some really interesting things here. So Redis, Telnet, SMB, and Docker API, these are all pretty much administrative-based things. They shouldn't be really on the internet. So especially not with a lack of authentication. So what we kind of assume from this is that attackers are looking for the weakest, the weakest credential, the weakest kind of authentication method, the weakest kind of like, I mean, if you're posting Redis on the internet, then maybe there's an issue there, that kind of thing. And then it's so easy to exploit, and it's so easy to get remote code execution from this, that it basically means that it's trivial for an attacker to then have an immediate foothold. So this is kind of just, I mean, it's a top 10, but it's an interesting insight as to what's going on there. I'm not going to go into too much detail about like where this is coming from because we're not into attribution, but like this is sort of where we're seeing a lot of the traffic come from. This is the top 10. Note that like the actual count on the highest one is quite low in comparison to the amount of probes, for example, here. So that's like in the millions, whereas this is in the thousands. That's because there are so many IP addresses doing this across the board. You can't really block all of them because they're all parts of botnets. So there'll be a lot of cases where a botnet will be used to do these exact attacks. So if you fall victim, if your system is exploited, then that would just be reused as part of this global exploitation machine. If we're looking at the usernames though, I mean, this is pretty standard. You would expect like root, admin, and user to be there. But what I find kind of interesting is it mirrors the administrative logon stuff. You have here Oracle user, FTP user, Postgres Ubuntu. Usuario is, I had to look that up, it's Spanish for username. So presumably there's a lot of attempts at Spanish exploitation. I don't know why that was happening. We were using a .com domain, but regardless. So I find that these sort of represent attackers being a little bit clever. Of course, attacking root makes sense because 99% of systems on a Linux machine are going to have a root account. But system administrators are getting kind of wise to the idea of not necessarily just advertising a root with a weak password. However, if you've got your FTP user, you might set it kind of flippantly with a weak password. And we see here some of the combos, some of the passwords, in fact, sorry, include literally a blank password. Now, that isn't necessarily something that you're going to be doing on a root account, but on a less common administrative account, like an FTP user or for your database, you might not realize that you're actually configuring it to point externally. You might think this is fine, this is just an internal database when you're configuring it. Let's set it with a blank password, or let's set it with the password of, as you can see there, like magnitude higher. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is the password. That's a ridiculous password to have, but you might set that without thinking, without realizing that actually what you're doing is advertising that server to the internet. So these are the top combinations as well. It's pretty self-explanatory. I think you'd probably guess that a lot of this is the case. It would be really bad if you knew that your root password and username was root 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So definitely change that if you see that there. And then these are some cherry-picked ones because I thought, like, we're seeing this happen. We might want to just maybe scare somebody. If you do see your username and password there, or even just your password, just yeah, you should change that pretty much immediately. I would definitely say that something like "this is my password" feels like it might be slightly more original. And you also get some situations here where there are some default credentials, like ZPS server, I believe, is a default credential. And it's interesting as well to see something like webmaster 1, 2, 3, 4 exclamation mark, etc. So yeah, just some cherry pick things there. So if we start getting into web applications, the part of the whole part of continuous security with us and what my personal preference of like research is web application, because I find that it's the front door and yet at the same time can lead to such an incredible like foothold potentially into a wider system. And so the types of traffic we actually manually looked through all of this. We identified what was potentially malicious, what was potentially just a spider, because of course if you've got a web application, it's going to be spidered as well by like Google, Bing, other crawlers. But all of these total requests here were ones that we identified as pretty much 99% certainty were malicious. So in this case, the vast majority, or at least more than half, were WordPress related. There are a lot of different WordPress type exploits. This isn't just trying to access the administrative interface of WordPress either. This is specifically trying to perform very almost contrived like exploits on WordPress machines. So kind of like simple to exploit kind of bugs. And we'll maybe have a look at some payloads in a second. But then things like sensitive files, so .env files, maybe where you've used Vim or Nano on a web server, you've edited a file, like your .env file, or maybe a WP config file, or just passwords.txt, something like that, that you think is hidden by like your htaccess. But then actually, when you've edited it with like Nano, that will then lead to a .save file being used, which might be perceived differently by the server and then exposed to the internet. Something really I found to be quite prevalent was like admin interface scanning. So this, of course, is just a small subset of what we see on a sort of general perspective. But in this case, like the admin interfaces weren't being hit as much. But like generally, what an attacker will do is exploit by finding admin interfaces and then brute forcing those. So although this is 119, that suggests that they weren't brute forced too heavily. But once an attacker finds like a foothold and finds an admin interface, for example, a WP admin or like a PHPMyAdmin admin interface, I say the word admin a lot, but I think you get what I mean. They can then start brute forcing. And more often than not, web applications have weaker credentials than simple SSH servers or something like that. And that's generally because I think people that are configuring the server with SSH are going to be more aware that that's going to be public facing, whereas something like phpMyAdmin or your database, that's going to not necessarily be something that you realize needs a strong password that is internet facing. Or you might be less technically minded. You might not realize that a weak password is going to be exploited really quickly. And then finally, the last three items on there: backdoors, open proxies, and Bitcoin wallets. These are kind of looking for issues that exist that they can then reuse to kind of like either get some basic money from you because for some reason you put wallet.dat on your server, which is a mistake, because that means that you're it's like putting all of your banking details, including like your CVV, whatever it is, like on the internet. But then backdoors as well, I find is kind of interesting because that's where like hackers are actually trying to hack like other machines that have been used. So if you've got like you see it sometimes where a botnet will stick a really obvious backdoor in, like a like backdoor.php or something to that effect. It's quite well known what the circulation of different backdoor PHP files are, and they often have passwords, but those passwords are hard coded, so you can kind of just use the same credentials there and access that person's backdoor, and therefore you're now in there like it was just you didn't even need to find the reader server or brute force SSH. So the guy that has already put a botnet or a crypto miner or like backdoor on there has already just given you open access. So this is just going through some exploits, some of the things that we've seen. I'm not going to go over them in too much detail because I don't think it's particularly worth it. But in this case, this is ThinkPHP, remote code execution, and there's no CVE for this. If you do use ThinkPHP, you should look at the security announcements. I think it's mainly a Chinese-based CMS though, so I couldn't expect too many people being using this particular type of content management system. Of course, we're seeing lots of log4shell type of exploits. This is like, I mean, this is in a GET request, but like you see it in every type of header. We'll get to that soon enough. We've got a whole post-mortem coming up. This is another one of the examples we have. This is local file inclusion from Apache. We'll get to that as well. That's a case study, but as you can see, that's trying to hit the etc hosts file. We also have here the Jquery file upload vulnerability. This just is a test to see if this file gets uploaded. If it does, they will upload a PHP shell. And then finally, the Telerik vulnerability. This is hitting ASP.NET applications. This is the vulnerability that I was referencing earlier, where we managed to get domain admin. So this one's harder to exploit, but if you find this endpoint and then you simply look at the source code, you'll see that it gives you the version details, so you can kind of figure out from there. So it's kind of a slightly more sophisticated, but like because they're Windows servers, they're a lot more interesting to hack, I find. So yeah, the TLDR on this is that anything that is exploitable, especially if it's easily exploitable, will be exploited. The more severe the vulnerability as well, the more likely it's going to be exploited across the whole internet at scale, as we saw with Log4Shell. And then we've got some case studies to sort of go into more details here. So the first, we were referencing earlier, the Apache HTTP server vulnerability. This was a local file inclusion vulnerability, and it was very, very easy to exploit. It was literally a single GET request. So we saw exploitation in the wild happening as soon as there was a proof of concept, and this is one of those where it was fixed in a rush, which led to the need for another patch to come out later down the line. So people would like update to the latest version, but the latest version would be vulnerable, so they would still be vulnerable. They would have to really stay on top of that patch cycle, on top of knowing what's happening there in order to move to the next sort of like the next version in order to avert this issue. There are some sort of technical details here, or like, at least from the CVE. What was found is that if if mod CGI is enabled, then this could lead to remote code execution. And this affected both Windows and Linux machines. It was quite wide-reaching. but the issue only affected 2.4.49, not earlier versions. So one of the key things from this one is that we noticed that people were updating to 2.4.5, which is the version that was supposedly not vulnerable, but from any previous version of Apache. And that basically led to them installing a vulnerable instance on their machine, on their server, not realizing a day later that there was a bypass found for the patch, and they previously weren't even vulnerable to this issue. I do think that patching is the best approach, but you need to stay on top of patches. You need to be aware as to what's going on, have a bit of technical knowledge behind what the exploit is and what the vulnerability is, because otherwise, yeah, you can be led into this kind of issue. And this is the impact. So this is the etc password file. Generally, it doesn't have sensitive information in itself, but it does show you every user on the system, and it shows you a few other interesting pieces of juicy enumeration details. But because you have any file that is accessible from the server, it means that you can basically, in some cases, get remote code execution just from file inclusion. Especially if it's like you can basically look at all the PHP files on the server, for example, things like that. So this is a small count from LeakIX, and it's basically, this is how many vulnerable services there were. This is about a month ago, actually, I believe, but like it's still quite a large amount, in the range of about 500–600. So yeah, we found that it wasn't something that was being fixed particularly quickly. Apache is, from my experience, something that isn't patched particularly regularly. And then a comparable amount of malicious servers, 100 of them that Grey Noise identified. Grey Noise have honeypots all over the world, and they look at IP addresses that are coming in with different malicious or benign traffic. And you can see here, this is a DigitalOcean instance that is attacking and trying to hit the Apache HTTP server path traversal attempt for that vulnerability, but also its log4j RCE attempt. There are a few things that each server will try, each like member of a botnet or each attacker will be looking for. They're not just generally looking for a single vulnerability. It's kind of like cast your net wide with the approach. So the second case study here is Umbraco. Umbraco is a .NET CMS, .NET meaning ASP.NET, so Windows, which increases, from my perspective at least, the potential intrigue for an attacker to then pivot. It's irrelevant if you're looking for wider sort of reaching stuff like in Linux or something, but like with Linux it's better for botnets, but with Windows it's better for pivoting and compromising an entire company. So there's something really interesting about this one, which is that there is still no CVE from my understanding, which is kind of strange, but at the same time it makes sense because the vulnerability isn't actually in Umbraco, it's in a third-party like library called Client Dependency Framework, I believe, yeah. And the Client Dependency Framework contains this issue, and it's a very small package. They're not particularly into CVEs or like that kind of thing. They patched, they're used, and it's great, but like the issue here is that it becomes difficult to track because a lot of us, I expect, use CVEs as a kind of metric, and the main way in which you stay informed as to what's vulnerable and what isn't. But this to me says immediately, well, I need to monitor like the actual channels from the providers themselves. So especially something that's like public facing, like a content management system or like something like a VPN service or something like that. You want to stay really on top of things like that. So like RSS feeds or something. Basically with this one, what we found is that quite a lot of clients were using Umbraco. We couldn't always enumerate the version, but we wrote an exploit for this because there wasn't too much stuff online. And once we wrote the exploit, we realized it was quite easy to distribute across all of our clients. And we found vulnerabilities that weren't even from like clients that we realized were running Umbraco. So they were still just using this third-party system of dependency handler, client dependency handler, and we would end up just going, oh, well, this is cool because whenever we find a vulnerability, whenever we create an exploit, we can now push that across everybody using our sort of distributed sort of custom scanning system, and internally as well. And then we can just get this massive level of assurance just from effectively a smaller amount of work. It's quite nice. And the impact is similar but different to the Apache vulnerability because this is Windows. Stuff like the web.config file can really lead to a lot of exposure of sensitive data. So this is full of like all kinds of API keys and credentials. It's pretty juicy. we did, thinking that we had like a custom unique exploit. We then went and tried this on a variety of bug bounty programs, similarly at scale. And what we found is that every single one was a duplicate, because bug bounty hunters are writing these exploits and keeping them for themselves because, I mean, why not? It makes you money. And then running that across the internet. And I found that kind of to be quite interesting, because that suggests that we've got a community of people that do have these exploits, because there's a small level, like bug bounty hunter doesn't pay that well, a small level of financial gain to be got from this. But when you think of it from the perspective of like an actual like black hat hacker, you can get a lot from this. You can, I mean, mining cryptocurrency for one, but like, I mean, just being able to compromise a full organization is probably going to pay better than the small bug bounty payouts or duplicates that you might get. So that suggests to me, in terms of a matter of like incentive, that internet-based attackers are going to be really looking at trying to like basically building as much as they can in terms of exploits that are maybe less common, or finding vulnerabilities, because it pays a lot better. So maybe, I don't know, paying bug bounty hunters is probably a better idea, but it's just a matter of changing the incentives. This is just the versions of Umbraco that are affected, and yeah, it was the client dependency framework versions, 1.8.2 onwards there. So finally, Log4Shell. We should all know about Log4Shell. It's a pretty concerning bug in Log4j. Log4j being a very, very popular Java logging library. It was like in about 80% of Java applications, because logging is like such a critical part of writing something, and this was kind of the de facto logging tool. The way it would work is basically, yeah, sorry, just this is the logo as well. And this is just a tweet basically describing how you've got your Steve Jobs on one hand, and then on the other hand, you've got people that, like the tiny team of maintainers at Log4j, that basically, without realizing it, introduce a bug that affects the entire internet, sets the internet on fire. It's just interesting. But yeah, basically, the bug, yeah, well, we'll go through the timeline, sorry. So it started in 2021, end of November, where there was somebody at Alibaba's group, their security team. They basically found that this vulnerability is there, has a major impact, and there was like a frantic rush to try and fix the issue. Some guys with cool Honeypot setups found really early evidence of public exploitation about like 6-7 days after that. We hadn't seen anything for a while until there was a tweet with a GitHub link containing a proof of concept exploit, which has since been deleted, but there's a web archive link. A piece of internet history there where it just had one like still. But this kind of like spread across security communities as people realized what this actually meant. At this point, you start seeing IP addresses scanning the whole internet. We've got here, yeah, Grey Noise identifying 2 with initial scanning on the 10th there. Bearing in mind, this is just like hours after the tweet comes out. We then start working on trying to figure out what's going on here, how to actually identify this vulnerability across all clients, understand the technical details of it, if there's any tooling we can build to try and like help us with assurance both internally and externally. And then the UK team wake up, and then we reach a point where collectively we realize that this is bigger than just something we can test black box. We can't just go and look for this bug using a tool. We need to get every client security team involved and let everybody know as soon as possible, because this is kind of a joint effort now. We don't know what's happening in the back end of everything. We found that some of our personal like things like Burp Suite, OWASP, Zap, they use Java under the hood, and they had updates come out. I'm not necessarily sure if they were vulnerable, because we're gonna update as soon as something like that comes out. But it was still, it's worth knowing that that affected everything. And yeah, within the day of the public exploit, there was 100 unique hosts found scanning the internet from Grey Noise. And then about 2.5, 3 hours after that, we now have 150 hosts. So there's kind of exponential growth, pretty concerning. And then we get around to basically open sourcing our internal scanning tool, because we've used it enough and we realize that this is probably going to help a lot of security teams. And this tool basically it allowed you to inject the payload into a bunch of different like headers. So what you can do is just browse the internet going through burp as your proxy with this plugin running, and then you'll get pingbacks exactly like this. So these are like for every JND I look up there, this is basically a vulnerability. I used this at the time on just the wider internet, and it was it was kind of fantastic to see. Just like on bug bounty hosts and things like that, you get pingbacks from places that you would never expect, or it's all these back-end systems interacting and giving you all kinds of crazy stuff. Like, so I wasn't taking any data from the back-end systems. I was just looking to see where there was a pingback, which is effectively, if you get a pingback, it's demonstrative that the vulnerability is there because there shouldn't be a DNS lookup. And yeah, actually seeing that happen on a lot of major websites was just like kind of eye-opening. And then shortly after that, there was a bypass found. So the dev team, the Log4j dev team, they were trying their hardest to get something out. And then there's a GitHub link right on Twitter that basically says, here's a proof of concept. At that point, they're like, well, we need to fix this now. We need to push out a fix immediately. The fix wasn't necessarily completely well sorted. They didn't realize that there was a bypass. And so it took a few days for a security researcher to actually find a bypass. And the whole process started again, involving the patching again, making sure that the versions are okay. And there were a few more after that that sort of like were more tenuous versions of the vulnerability, but it was a really specifically bad bypass to find, because it just, yeah, the whole process then starts again. We had to update our tool, for example, and distribute that. And then today we definitely see mass exploitation still occurring. So from memory, a recent report was done saying that about 70% of instances have been fixed, but that still remains about 30 instances that are 30% of instances that were found on Log4Shell across the internet, which is a massive number. Like it's just, yeah, you can't really expect like a full uptake on people being able to fix this kind of thing. But bearing in mind that it leads to remote code execution and just full compromise of all kinds of back-end systems, yeah, then it needs to be looked into. And this is just Log4Shell everywhere. So in terms of remediation, because a lot of this has been talking about problems, talking about things that people are doing, taking that kind of like pen tester perspective and trying to look at offensive security. But what we found, and what I think is probably wise advice, is that asset management is king. It's the utmost importance, because you may be able to patch something, and that's fine, and you might be able to put in firewall rules, you might be able to try and defend a piece of like a service that you have or a system you have, but if you don't know what your system is, at that point you're going to potentially become compromised and you're going to be blind to it. That blindness is a problem, which we're tackling in a way that I'll get to it, but we offer a free asset management sort of service thing. So yeah, how do you properly secure something you don't know about? COVID-19, as well as sort of several other facts in the modern way that things are deployed, it's massively increased the size of an external attack surface. So be aware, right? Like be aware that everything that's on the internet is going to be being hit. There are some common things to check here. So you've got your legacy servers and public IP addresses. Like legacy servers are hard to find, but what you can do is like look at certificate transparency logs, use systems like Shodan and Census, which are scanning the internet and then disclosing that data. And then you can do stuff like TLS, like certificate common name lookups. And then you can find where maybe you've got like an old domain is on a certificate and that's pointing at a specific server, for example. In your cloud management system, you should be able to look at all public IP addresses. Finding stuff like all domains, your root level and subdomains as well. So I recommend doing a lot of subdomain enumeration. Like even if it is like a system where you feel like you know everything that's on a subdomain, you can still, there are some really good tools out there. For example, I think security trails are pretty useful for finding subdomains, where they will just disclose everything that's like publicly known. And then you can actually, it's the amount of times that something has surprised myself or like a client is ridiculous. It's also worth looking into where maybe you've got users that are being hit from cred breaches because password stuffing attacks are becoming quite prevalent. There we go. Yeah, so in terms of quick wins, right, there is no silver bullet for security. I think that's kind of a reasonable thing to say. It's a shame, and it is kind of what it is. But at the same time, we're not looking for a silver bullet to secure everything in every which way. We're not looking for like a perfect system. Instead, we're looking to kind of be better than the bad actors that are looking at this across the entire internet. We don't want to be the weakest link in the chain. So don't expose administrative levels to the internet. Instead, use a VPN to hide things behind, if, for example, like with WordPress, make sure to like IP lock what can actually access your WP admin. 2FA on just everything with a login. That will really help in a lot of cases. Make sure to use like a 2FA app rather than just text, but regardless, it's better to have 2FA than not. In terms of bad IP addresses, there are a few tools you can use, such as fail to ban, which will help you put like IP addresses that are performing brute forcing attacks into a jail, and then like they'll basically be prevented from being able to attack you anymore. But then there are also more modern solutions, for example, CrowdSec, which basically are like a CrowdSec, not CloudSec. They are open source and have like a kind of mothership that people send analytics data to that is like stripped of anything sensitive, and that basically tells them this is a bad IP address, this is a good IP address, and then you can get that information back. So it's kind of like crowdsourcing bad actors. This is an obvious one, but staying up to date with software and patching, I think that's a given. Staying on top of it doesn't necessarily mean having a patch cycle of once a month. That means consistent monitoring. That means continuous monitoring. And then finally, configuring firewalls properly to make sure that you're not exposing something like your Docker API or Redis. Try and go for, instead of allow all, instead go for deny all, except for specific services you need. And that should help you with the majority of these attacks. So in terms of the continuous security, the continuous scanning and testing, the first question is, how much do you trust your internal patch cycles? Is it the case that you can actually find when there's a vulnerability, and then as soon as there's like a bypass found, or if there's a new issue, that you can be patching immediately? Or is it more that there's a period of time in between that? Pen testing as well, if you're looking at your pen testing cycle, that could potentially be too late to find the issue. Say you've got a custom Java web app that is like business critical, and you get that pen tested once a year because there are some code changes that happen. Firstly, it might be the matter that you get the pen test on October 2021, and then don't realize like a month or so later that Log4Shell comes out, is disclosed, is discovered, and then this entire application is very, very vulnerable. You may be completely blind to that. That's generally going to be an issue. Also, if you make a code change in that web application, at that point you could have introduced a vulnerability that might have been found by a pen test. So the kind of advice here is to use techniques from like continuous integration, continuous deployment. Like try and make sure that for everything especially where it comes to code changes, make sure that you retest using like regression testing and different like scans to make sure that the actual like the application itself doesn't have any of the common issues that might be found, because the common stuff is where you find a lot of the bad actors sort of finding are hitting across the internet. There are different techniques for monitoring your technology stack throughout the organization. As I mentioned before, monitoring releases channel for new software. That's a good way of doing it. RSS feeds, that's the approach that I use. Open CVE is a really good platform. And then you can look at previous CVEs that were found, because CVEs, although there are some that are missed, is a fantastic gold standard for this kind of thing. In terms of the attack surface stuff that I mentioned earlier, we offer free attack surface appraisals for organizations. It's basically you give us some domains, and then we'll have a look at the subdomains that we find. We'll find potentially some interesting stuff there, any IP addresses that are related, any associated hosts, so domain names that maybe you didn't even know you owned, but through different heuristics we've actually identified across the internet, as potentially being part of the organization, as well as looking at some basic stuff with like credential breaches to see which users are maybe more highly exposed for password stuffing attacks. And generally, yeah, it's a bit of an easy overview, but it's very much the first step in actually understanding things in a continuous security kind of perspective. And this is how we do it internally. Honestly, everything we do internally is stuff that we've discussed here. It's not so much a matter of that we're doing anything different to what we're talking about. It's just that we do it kind of at a scale and with a bunch of really good security consultants and security experts. And it's pretty much just a package implementing all of this. Once we've figured out the attack surface through the identification of things, we then just start sticking it through the scanners and we start manually probing at things to see what's interesting. And we built this massive scanning system to allow us to do things like test for that on Bracco vulnerability at scale. So like basically what we're doing is we're collating data from multiple scanners and these custom detection scripts, and we're getting stuff in from the honeypots and testing that as well. And then that's all sort of bootstrapped together, pushed into the scanner, and then we get the results from that. The CST team will receive immediate alerts from the scanners, and then this will give them quick vulnerability verification abilities. Once the vulnerability is verified, the client gets an immediate alert, or internally, we then get an immediate alert and try and fix something. And at the end of each month, you get a report, which gives you sort of an overview as to where your status is. It's a lot more like a conventional pen testing report. And every month, everything is retested. So if there are any open vulnerabilities from the previous month, that's tested again. If it's fixed, great. If it isn't, then that just means that we still maintain keeping it on the report, and therefore that report is like a constantly up-to-date pen test. Yeah, so that's everything. Anybody got any questions? I know I went on a little bit longer there, but hopefully we still have time.
No, you were fine, Rob. Thank you for that. That was great. Really interesting. And I hope everyone that joined found it interesting as well. As mentioned at the beginning, we've got a few Q&As, and we've had 4 across already. Anybody that thinks of anything that isn't covered in the following 4, just pop them in the chat box or pop us an email afterwards. So I'll start with the first one that came in a little earlier in the presentation. So can you provide this continuous security scan service for internal infrastructure, not just internet exposed areas?
Yeah, so the asset management stuff, not so much. I mean, that would be like internal port scans, but the asset management and asset discovery, that's generally going to be an external thing. But the actual scanning that we offer, that can be done internally as well through like an agent that is installed on a local network. And from that, we can also do like port scans and sort of like host discovery and stuff like that. I would advise just getting in touch with like an account manager there, or just dropping us an email to actually figure out what your needs are. But yeah, this can work internally as well. It's probably useful on both, yeah.
And someone has asked, can you send over a list of the tools that you've used during this, please?
Yeah, I can.
We'll share everything we've covered in the in an email following, including the attack surface appraisal.
Yeah, I'll add some tools into the email just that you can send.
Fab, thank you. And just a couple more. What's the best approach for dealing with new vulnerabilities that haven't got patches but are being exploited?
So I guess like the example for that one would be like Log4Shell, where there was like an exploit that was being a vulnerability that was being exploited. I would say for that, the kind of thing we saw is like the web application firewalls were kind of the main like stopping point. So like with the bigger customers and the bigger clients and the bigger organizations, they would implement really robust like WAF rules that would block like stuff that had any of those specific symbols like in a specific regular expression. And that wouldn't necessarily stop a dedicated attacker, but it would definitely stop like the vast majority of stuff happening on the internet. So like your exploited in the wild stuff, everything that's being scanned across the internet, if you have some basic WAF rules that stop that particular payload coming in, obviously you need to be aware of the payload and the exploit. But yeah, then you're able to basically prevent that at scale.
Perfect.
Any other
There's
questions?
just a couple more. There's a few that have just come through just a second ago as well. How can we find those 5 to 10% of unknown assets? Is there a tool that can cover those, etc.?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I missed it completely.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no problem. How can we find those 5 to 10% of unknown assets? Is there a tool that can help with that?
Oh yeah, so I mean, obviously, to plug ourselves, we do that. That's like our thing, the attack surface appraisals. So genuinely just drop an email and that should be easy enough for us to do. If you want to start doing it internally, there are a few manual techniques that are quite useful, but in terms of tooling, I guess Amass is probably one of the better ones because it can help you identify stuff using like ASN IP sort of ranges, and you can also do loads of subdomain enumeration there. But also at the same time, you've got stuff like Shodan, which will help you look at like the entire internet, and Security Trails as well. Security Trails is like a third-party platform, but they offer some associated hosts. I think it's a subscription model, but yeah, they're pretty good to sort of get the ball rolling and start looking into things. But it's realistically, it's one of those where it helps to come to us. Like using a security expert, I find is the best way to go about actually like getting attack surface management rather than just having ad hoc tools running.
Great, thank you. And I know we're pressing for time, so just quickly, and the last one that just came in a second ago is, can AI get compromised as well?
That's quite a broad question. So it depends on the platform. It depends on it depends entirely on what it is that's running. But like there are AI adversarial attacks in which you can sort of like undermine the way that like a machine learning algorithm was sort of like put together. There's actually some research we're doing internally around artificial intelligence and these kinds of adversarial attacks, but they're not generally going to be exploited in the wild in any kind of way like this. They're generally going to be a lot more focused, especially with the way that AI is developing.
Great. And then
stay tuned, actually, yeah, we'll come out with more on that one.
Great. And then somebody has asked around staff training. To that person in particular, we'll send you an email with some options because we do offer training. So one of the team will get in touch with you directly to discuss what it is you're looking for and so forth like that.
Secure are brilliant.
Yeah, we can recommend some. Great. All right. Well, finally then, just a big thanks from myself on behalf of Clarinet and from Rob. And we'll share, as I said, we'll be sharing the link to the free attack surface appraisal via the email this afternoon, along with a recording of this if you want to watch it back.
And I'll make a list of some useful tools as well that we can stick in the email for people.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other questions you have that haven't been answered in the 6 or 7 that just came through a moment ago, feel free to email or reply to the email that we'll share this afternoon with all of the links from today's webinar. Thanks everyone for joining, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.